Good evening to those of you joining us from the United States, and good morning to everyone joining from China and elsewhere in Asia. I guess it's a fun thing to be able to say good morning to tomorrow for those of you that are already in the 12th of January. We are delighted to have all of you gathered to celebrate another milestone in the extensive relationship between Fudan University and the University of Virginia. That relationship has developed over the course of just a few years. Our two universities have coalesced to create opportunities for students and teachers alike at both Fudan University and here in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia. This partnership resulted in the creation of UVA's Shanghai First program, a program for incoming first years, offering them the opportunity to study abroad alongside Fudan students. Unfortunately, the program had to be postponed from its launch date until the fall of 2020, but launch date in the fall of 2020, but we are excited to offer the opportunity in years to come. And as the novel coronavirus shut down the majority of UVA study abroad opportunities, both because of COVID and related travel restrictions, so too were 75 students from China prohibited from coming to the United States. So as such, Fudan took these students in where they have been learning alongside students in Shanghai. We are excited to welcome many of them virtually today with the hopes of having them here in Charlottesville in person at some point soon. Thank you to everyone at Fudan for all that you have done. We are excited to see this partnership grow and prosper. And at a time when bilateral relations have been filled with strife, university partnerships like this one can provide frank exchanges and that help deepen and advance mutual understanding. On a personal note, I was last at Fudan in 2012 when I was with the Brookings Institution and was hosted for a meeting with faculty and students for a book I was writing called Inside Out, India and China, Local Politics Go Global. It is a special university and truly one of the leading places in China that studies and provides exchanges with the United States. We'd like to thank the Center for American Studies and Professor Wu Xinhua for diligently working to make today's forum happen. Also, on behalf of all of us here at the Miller Center, thank you to the Center for Politics and UVA Global for partnering with us on this event. We could not have made this happen without you. From Shanghai to Charlottesville, we find ourselves in a pivotal moment on so many fronts, and significantly so for the future of U.S. China relations. On a range of global issues, from the pandemic to the global economy to climate change, this bilateral relationship is essential to coming up with global solutions. And yet both nations are wrestling with the disruptions of globalization, from concerns about displaced jobs through global trade to mutual vulnerability due to the global coronavirus pandemic. So as we in the United States look past the Trump presidency, the core questions are whether President-elect Biden's policies on China will continue with the incendiary rhetoric and confrontational politics on the pandemic, on trade and security, on Hong Kong and Taiwan. Under President Trump, our two economies began to decouple. Reversing that trend does not appear to be at the top of President-elect Biden's to-do list. Similarly, in the recent fifth plenum on the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee in October, the party set goals to become self-sufficient in various areas, including technology and security, effectively aiming to cut the United States out where possible. Each country seems to be retreating from the other. That being said, these are early days for the Biden presidency. The president-elect has yet to outline many specific China policies. On many potent issues, the president-elect will likely consult and work closely with top officials, such as his Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, U.S. Trade Representative, and various China experts. Furthermore, both the president-elect himself and some of his nominees have named alliance building and alliance mending as top priorities. Over the course of his campaign, he highlighted the importance of strong bilateral relations, but also in rediscovering America's global and internet multilateral presence. So one can expect he will consult with European, Japanese, Korean, Indian, and Australian leaders, among others. He can also be expected to work to forge bipartisan agreement on the bilateral relationship. Likewise, China will need to determine how it views a Biden presidency. To help us parse through all of the potential these next 4 years hold, and the various complicating factors, we are delighted to have two panels of talented and wise scholars to share their insights. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us tonight or tomorrow, and we are excited to embark on this conversation. As our guests in China are about to see, we have assembled a truly first-rate group of some of the best minds on these issues in the United States. And I want to thank all of them for joining us on what will be surely a fascinating conversation. I also want to thank the production teams at both Fudan and at the Miller Center who have worked hard to coordinate for this terrific and complicated event. So now finally, I'll hand the Zoom microphone to the exceptionally talented and creative Shirley Lin. Shirley is the Compton Visiting Professor at the Miller Center and has been the principal designer behind tonight's event. Thank you, Shirley, for all that you do, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Welcome everyone for this forum, which includes a live audience in Shanghai, as you can see on your Zoom. It's been a pleasure to put this program together with Fudan friends to strengthen understanding between the US and China in a pivotal moment in the two countries' relationship. I want to thank all the panelists and fellow moderator, Ambassador Steve Mull, and our colleagues, Justin Ojak and Stephanie Georgakis, who have made this possible. Allow me to present our four wonderful experts for the first panel on domestic politics in the US and China. Professor Larry Sabato is the founder of the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. A leader in political forecasting, Larry is well known for his newsletter, Sabato's Crystal Ball, and appears regularly on major television networks. He will analyze the 2020 election campaigns, their outcomes, and the controversies surrounding them. Next is our Miller Center's Catherine Tempest, an expert on the American presidency, who is, like me, also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Katie will place the Biden transition in historical perspective and also assess Biden's appointments so far, focusing on pressures to have more diversity and Obama alumni in the administration. Our third panelist is also our Miller Center's Chris Liu, who had previously served as Deputy Secretary of Labor, White House Cabinet Secretary, and Assistant to President Obama. Currently on Biden's transition team, he will assess how domestic issues influence the elections and affect America's foreign policy going forward. Finally, Professor Xing Qiang, who is the Deputy Director of the Center for American Studies, has published numerous award-winning books around the world in English and in Chinese. He will analyze the October 2020 fifth plenum of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee and discuss the implications of Beijing's domestic and foreign policy agenda contained in China's new 5-year plan that starts this year. So let me hand it over to Larry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley, and it's good to see you. Good to see the other panelists, most of whom I know in one capacity or another. I've got 8 minutes to discuss the presidential election of 2020. I couldn't even begin to cover the headlines in that period of time, but I'm going to mention a few key facts, many of which you probably are already familiar with, but I want to stress several. The first is, despite what you may have seen President Trump saying, this was an extraordinarily secure and accurate election. Virtually everything that President Trump has had to say about the election is false. All of his attacks on state election officials, on the final count, on the supposed vote fraud in Georgia and Pennsylvania and elsewhere, has absolutely no basis in fact. And if you have followed President Trump's career, you won't be at all surprised by this. One of my former students, in fact, was in charge of running the election or the security for the election. His name is Christopher Krebs, former head of the cybersecurity part of Homeland Security, dedicated to protecting the election in every way that he could reasonably do. We had a problem with this, let's say, in 2016. But he did a superb job He was lauded by both parties, everybody involved in the election. And for his trouble, he was fired on Twitter by President Trump, because President Trump wanted him to tell an untruth, which was that the election was not secure and that vote fraud had switched hundreds of thousands or millions of votes to Trump's disfavor. In any event, Chris is doing just fine and will be doing lots of things, including being a visiting scholar at my Center for Politics at UVA. So the election was completely sound. The second fact I want to stress is that President-elect Biden won a very solid victory. He got an absolute majority of the vote, 51.4%. And in this era, that's nearly a landslide. And what do I mean by that? We live in highly partisan, and people take their party identification very seriously, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, and tiny percentages are affiliated with the Libertarian Party or the Green Party or some other political association. But overwhelmingly, in fact, 95, 96% or more of the American electorate identifies with either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And not surprisingly, about 95% of Democrats voted for Biden and 95% of Republicans voted for Trump. The good news for Biden is there are more Democrats than Republicans, particularly after the unusual events of the Trump presidency over the last 4 years. So Biden got the absolute majority. He won by 7 million votes. Unfortunately, in the United States, because of an archaic institution called the Electoral College, which dates from the very beginning of the American Constitutional Republic, the popular vote means nothing nationally. It means everything in each of our 50 states, plus the District of Columbia. They're assigned electoral votes based on their population, but the small populated states get a bonus. They get 2 extra votes for their senators. The highly populated states do too, but it matters much more for the small states. And that's how Republicans win the presidency. George W. Bush won the presidency in 2000, even though he lost the popular vote by 549,000. We thought that was a lot in 2000. And now, of course, we recognize that you can win the presidency even when you lose the popular vote in a landslide. Hillary Clinton in 2016 defeated President Trump in terms of the popular vote by close to 3 million votes, yet she lost decisively in the Electoral College. Fortunately for President-elect Biden, he won by 7 million votes, and that was enough to carry some key swing states narrowly so that he could win the Electoral College. Even though he had very close races in some of the swing states, he was able to accumulate 306 electoral votes. Under our system, you need 270 electoral votes, a majority of the Electoral College, to win the presidency. And you may say, well, 306 doesn't sound like much since you need 270. Well, it was called a landslide by President Trump in 2016 because he received 306 electoral votes, exactly the same total, different states, but the same total. Joe Biden was able to win back the formerly Democratic states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and he also carried 2 states that have been very elusive for Democrats for many, many years, Arizona and Georgia. He also won individual congressional districts, one individual congressional district in Nebraska. President Trump won the other one in Maine. So the total is actually quite impressive in the Electoral College, the total of popular votes even more so. He has a firm base from which to govern. He has a diverse cabinet being formed, which nicely matches his vice presidential choice, Senator Kamala Harris from California. And she will be the first woman to be vice president. She is of Indian descent, Black descent, She connects with lots of constituencies in the United States, and she will have a major role now because of what happened in the congressional elections. The House of Representatives is staying Democratic. The Democrats won the House in the midterm election in the middle of Donald Trump's one term for president in 2018. And the Democrats won it fairly handily. This time, I think the surprise was that Democrats actually lost seats in the House, but they've maintained a majority. They have 222 seats. It could expand to 223 once the final races are decided. You need 218 to control. So they'll be able to manage, and the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, who's continuing in that role, is very skilled at running the House. She has had two separate stints as Speaker of the House from 2007 to 2011, and then a separate stint beginning in 2019. The Senate was the surprise. Democrats had many opportunities to carry Senate seats and should have had a majority, really, as of the November 3rd general election. But there were some close races that didn't go their way. And again, the partisanship played a part. It's almost impossible anymore to win a Senate seat, or for that matter, a House seat, if it's not carried by the nominee of your party for president. So in the Senate races, for example, you had just one Senate seat in the state of Maine that was won by a Republican, while the Democrat, Joe Biden, was winning the presidency. All of the other Senate seats were won by the nominee of the party that was winning the presidency in that state. And in 2016, it was 100% of the states elected that had Senate seats up, elected senators from the same party as the winning presidential candidate in their state. So again, as I say, because it's difficult to break that partisan barrier, it's remarkable that the Democrats won the presidency by the amount they did. They kept the House, and with special elections for two seats in Georgia, which just occurred on January 5th, they won both of the seats in a pretty conservative state. Biden won it very narrowly, 10, 12,000 votes total, which is nothing in a state the size of Georgia. But the two Senate candidates for the Democrats, both of whom had been expected to lose when the campaign started, because people, I think, wanted to send a message to Donald Trump. The Democrats won both of them, I think, in a considerable upset, and they won by very substantial margins, 50, 60, 70,000 votes. So the Democrats control the Senate because of the tie-breaking vote of the Vice President Harris. It's 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans, but the Vice President breaks all ties. So the Senate will be organized for Democrats, thanks to the tie-breaking vote. The Senate will vote for most of President Biden's objectives and plans and programs and the bills he submits because of the 50-50 split with the tie broken by the Vice President. So actually, things are beautifully set up for President-elect Biden, at least in the beginning. An act of God on any given day can change the composition of the Senate, or for that matter, the House. And if we have more invasions of Capitol Hill, like the despicable one that we saw last Wednesday, January 6th, a mob that was incited by President Trump and for which he will probably be impeached in a couple of days' time. Now, he won't leave office early because it will simply go to the Senate for trial. We're not sure of whether the trial will be held right away or will be delayed until President Biden gets his cabinet confirmed and much of his program through. But this has been a chaotic, a very discouraging, very autocratic, authoritarian, and un-American presidency. And most of us are delighted that it is coming to an end. I hope you don't mind my being so frank, but that's the way I am. We are concerned about the last few days of the Trump presidency because he is capable of absolutely anything. But he's being watched carefully in ways that he may not quite imagine. And I think we'll make it through. The new president is sworn in at noon on January the 20th. That's next Wednesday, not this Wednesday, but the following Wednesday. And we'll all breathe a little easier because I think President Biden is more predictable. He is certainly more cautious, and in every way I can think of, he is more prudent than President Trump. And I believe I've used my 8 minutes exactly, Shirley, and so I don't want to step on any other panelist's time.
Right. Well, we will come back to you during the Q&A. I'm sure there will be many questions. Thank you very much.
Thank
Katie.
you.
Hello?
Classic mistake with the Zoom. Anyway, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. And I've been asked to talk about the history of presidential transitions, how President Biden has fared, or President-elect Biden has fared during his transition, and what the early appointments look like in both the cabinet and the White House. So first off, let me just start by putting the American presidential transition into a little bit of context and give you a brief historical overview. I think it's important to note that what we have in the United States regarding the transition is uniquely American. We basically have a 78-day period in which a president-elect and his team will put together a team, a group of personnel, and will try to do their best to learn what's going on throughout the government so that they can be prepared to take over on January 20th. It's important to, I think, try to provide some sort of explanation of our unique system. And one way to do so is to think about our government in the shape of a pyramid, with the most senior officials at the top of the pyramid. And what our country does every 4 or every 8 years is lop off the top of that pyramid, such that incoming administrations have roughly 4,000 political appointees, 1,300 of which require Senate confirmation. So it is a vast undertaking, and personnel is the primary focus during that transition phase. In terms of history, I think it's easiest to start with Dwight Eisenhower. And that's because in 1933, there was a passage of the 20th Amendment, which changed the inauguration date from March to January and effectively shortened the transition period. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first president who had just a 78-day period transition. Interestingly, correspondence shows, though, that Harry Truman invited him to the White House to meet with himself and the cabinet, and Dwight D. Eisenhower turned down the invitation. And other than that, we didn't really know much about transitions. It wasn't until John F. Kennedy in 1960 decided to use some of his campaign funds so that he could provide some funding to 2 individuals, Clark Clifford, a well-known former Democratic White House staffer, very knowledgeable in government, and a presidency scholar named Richard Neustadt. John F. Kennedy did not want to enter the White House without having a better sense of what was expected and what he needed to do. He hired them, he utilized campaign funds to hire more people for a transition. Shortly thereafter, we had, for the first time in American history, Congress getting involved with presidential transitions and a recognition that this is a formal process. And so in 1963, we had the passage of the Presidential Transitions Act. And that's the first time that the government recognized that this 78-day period is very critical. Since then, it's sort of been kind of just, very sort of routine. You hear a little bit about who's in charge of the presidential transition team. You get a sense for the individuals on the campaign working diligently as they go forward, but there's really not much drama associated with it. When we look back, since 1963, there have been several amendments to this act, and the most significant amendments occurred after 9/11. The 9/11 Commission recommended that there be much more access to national security and top secret documents for this incoming team. And as such, that's the most pivotal change that has occurred since 1963 with the Presidential Transitions Act. In addition, this act also enabled the incoming transition team to circulate throughout the government to interview existing staffers and bureaucrats to get a sense of what they can expect. What are the pressing issues? What are the crises that they need to worry about when they take office on January 20th? Most notably, I think, in sort of the history of transitions would be 2001, and that is simply because there was the contested election in Florida, which truncated the transition time. Nevertheless, apparently Dick Cheney was preparing for assuming the presidency from his living room, and the Bush administration or the Bush team was going about getting ready for the assuming office after January 20th. In 2008, that particular transition was thought to be the gold standard because President Bush made it very clear to his staff that they needed to do everything they could to make the transition very smooth for the Obama team. In 2016, Obama did the same and was very serious and instructed his staff to prepare briefings, documents for the next president, whomever it might be. It turns out it was President Trump, and while the Obama administration very carefully prepared for this transition, the Trump administration, or the President Trump and his team, transition team, were much less interested in many of the activities and many of the meetings and tabletop exercises across the board. There tended to be sparse attendance. It's also important to note that the day after the election, President Trump fired Chris Christie, who was in charge of the transition. According to Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk, apparently Mike Pence et al., who took over the transition, essentially threw away all of the work and the documents that Chris Christie and his crew has prepared. So that is a highly unusual transition. Despite the Obama's best effort to help them get prepared for assuming office, it wasn't reciprocated. Nevertheless, it was peaceful and smooth. So here we are in 2020, and what has happened in 2020? Well, I think similar to what we've seen throughout the Trump administration in terms of shattering norms, a little bit of chaos. The biggest issue in this transition was that the GSA administrator, who was required and who was able to release the funding for the transition, she refused to ascertain or certify the election results such that President-elect Biden could start to receive access across the federal government, start to receive the president's daily brief, start to obtain security clearances for his staff members. All of that was delayed by almost 3 weeks, which represents roughly a quarter of the transition time. Once they gained access around November 23rd, there were pockets of dissent in the Department of Defense, in OMB, at the U.S. Trade Representative's office, where they were unwilling to give the Biden transition team access or to help them. I would say that despite these two distinct disadvantages, the Biden team has in reality been working since last spring. Once they knew that that Joe Biden, or then Vice President Biden would be the Democratic nominee, I'm sure that they were working on vetting and trying to determine which candidates that they would nominate if there was the possibility that they won the presidential election. I think that the United States is benefited immensely by the extensive experience that both the president-elect and his transition team have. Many of these individuals worked for President Obama. Several even worked for President Clinton as well. The vice president and president-elect himself, of course, has 8 years of executive branch experience. At a time when we lost almost 25% of the transition period, it helps immensely to have people on the transition team that know how the government works. They know what needs to be done and how to do it. So how have they done? I spoke about the fact that there are roughly 4,000 presidential appointments that need to be made, and of those, roughly 1,300 require Senate confirmation. So far, President-elect Biden has assembled the 15 key cabinet members that are in the line of presidential succession. He has hired the most women. He has appointed the first Native American. He has appointed the first woman to become Secretary of the Treasury. He has appointed the first Black to become the Secretary of Defense. He's hired the first Hispanic to become the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. There are many historic firsts. If you also look further and look at his White House staff appointments, again, you see more women than any of his predecessors going back to Reagan. And you also see a large number of non-white appointments. I think in addition to that, the White House Transition Project has a pace tracker where they compare the pace of appointments going all the way back to President-elect Jimmy Carter's transition. And it shows that despite the 3-week delay, President Biden's pace of appointments is ahead of all of his 7 predecessors. So in addition to what I think will be creating the most diverse set of presidential appointees in American history, they are well ahead of pace compared to their predecessors. This is a historic period. It's a historic transition because of the ascertainment. I'm hoping that going forward, that the ascertainment provision has some sort of reform that makes it sort of black and white as to whether the winner of the presidential election can be determined sooner. We don't need delays like that, especially in a period where we have a coronavirus. The economy is experiencing extreme volatility. We have high levels of racial tension. This was a bad time for that to happen. But I think despite this truncated transition, the Biden team has done just about as good a job as they could have. And I'll leave it at that and pass the baton to Chris.
Thank you, Katie. Chris.
Thank you all for having me. I've been asked to speak about the role of domestic policies in the election and the impact on U.S. foreign policy. Before I do that, though, I can't not talk about the events of last Wednesday. What we saw was an insurrection, an unprecedented attack on the Capitol that was incited by the President of the United States. It's not something that we see in really any civilized country. And the reason I flag all of this is if you look at the visual images of the people marching on the Capitol, they weren't marching for tax cuts. They weren't marching for lower health care. They were marching to take back their country. And it was broader symbols of the election being stolen, their way of life being changed. And in many ways, last Wednesday's riot exemplified what the election was about. It wasn't about policy. It was about the character of the nominees, their personalities. It was their visions. If you look at President Trump, his slogan, "Make America Great Again," harkens back to a time that his followers believe was a better time than where we are now. Joe Biden talked on the campaign trail from day one about this being a fight for the soul of our nation. So this election, much like many elections, wasn't about contrasting policies. It was about contrasting visions, contrasting personalities. That being said, there were underlying policy differences, and the most significant one was the handling of the COVID pandemic. The president's mishandling of early on the continued flouting of public health guidelines, the unprecedented recession that was caused by this pandemic. And that really was a pivot point and a way for Joe Biden to talk more about his vision, his sense of leadership. And it really highlighted in many ways the contrasting policies between the two candidates, whether it was on immigration and tighter borders, whether it was on the availability of healthcare, whether it was on the systemic income, the systemic economic inequalities, and how, throughout the pandemic, those that were being most affected from a health perspective and from an economic perspective were often poor people, people of color. So while it is fair to say policy wasn't what drove people's decision in this election, those underlying policy differences, I think, speak to different visions of where the country should go, different leadership styles. I think as you look forward to the policies of the Biden administration and how the domestic policies will influence foreign policy, it is fair to say that this is an administration, the new administration that will come in, will be more engaged with multilateral institutions like the United Nations. The president-elect has already talked about rejoining the World Health Organization. He's already talked about re-entering the Paris climate change agreements. He's talked more broadly about strengthening our allies, not just with our two allies on our border here in North America, but also those in Europe and Asia. But what you don't hear this president-elect talking about is free trade. Now, Joe Biden was a president who voted for the North American Free Trade Agreement, who helped push the Trans-Pacific Alliance, the Trans-Pacific Partnership during the Obama administration. And what you see more broadly in this country, notwithstanding the change in parties, is this really powerful nationalistic sentiment that drives much of the economic policies, frankly, in both political parties. It is difficult to conceive in this current political climate in the United States, regardless of who is the president, regardless of who controls Congress, that a free trade agreement like Trans-Pacific Partnership could get done in this climate. Obviously, President Trump was able to get changes made to Nafta. I think most people that looked at that would say those were fairly cosmetic changes that did not have great significance. And I do think when you peel back what the President-elect Biden has talked about, his broad Build Back Better proposals, he's talked a lot about how do we buy more American products through the federal government buying purchase? How do we bring more jobs back to the United States? Again, he's not using the nationalistic rhetoric of Donald Trump, but underlying all of that is many of the same themes. And I think while you will see greater engagement internationally from this president, and it will be in a very constructive, multilateral way, it won't be this kind of transactional one-on-one way that Donald Trump liked to do business. I do think the domestic politics within the United States make it very challenging to engage economically with many countries in kind of that free trade world that has existed in previous presidencies. I would also argue more importantly, and point this out, and we can talk more about this, that there is right now in the country of the United States a very strong anti-China sentiment. And that really is one, unfortunately for Chinese Americans like me, I think will have significant implications for those of us living here in the country, as well as the U.S. policies towards China. So I'm going to stop there and leave some more time for other people. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Let's turn it over to the China perspective. Professor Xing Qiang, who is sitting in a room with hundreds of people. 辛老师，没看到了。
Yes, I think now the life in China has been back to normal, and I hope that soon the world will resume the normality after the pandemic. And it's a great opportunity to share some of my observation in this conference. And thank you, Shirley. In last October, the CCP held the 5th plenum of the Central Committee and issued the communique and outlined the blueprint for next 5 years national development. But it's really very hard to explain the wide spectrum of numerous domestic and foreign policies in just 8 minutes. And I will try to provide some of my observation. First and foremost, I think the communique pointed out the strategic assessment of the international environment, as well as the domestic top priorities of the CCP in the upcoming 5 years. First, the communique declared that peace and development remain the theme of the era. It sounds cliche, but it means the comprehensive modernization and national development will be the unequivocal top priority for Chinese leadership. And second, the communique stated that China remains in a period of strategic opportunity, which means China thinks we will have a future with more opportunities than challenges. The third is the communique warned that China must be cautious with various risks and challenges and coordinate the requirement of national security and economic and social development. Concerning the risk, I think Beijing is worrying about tri-dimensional challenges. The first is the fact that international institution rules and norms has been hurt significantly. In the past few years, concurrent with the anti-globalization and populism movement throughout the world, we can see that international organizations can be kicked off, international treaty and agreements can be torn as a piece of waste paper, and unilateral sanctions can be imposed presumptuously without any effective check and balance. The second risk is the unprecedented deterioration of the U.S. China relations. Trump administration launched the whole of government or even whole of society suppression against China. And now the relations between these two biggest economies in the world has turned, as I termed, become a three no's relations. No mutual trust, no high-level political interaction, and no cooperation. The third risk is the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Overshadowed by the pandemic, the global supply chain has been breached, and no one knows when and how an epidemic will come to the end. In view of these aforementioned risks and challenges looming ahead, China has no choice, in my view, but to establish a kind of bottom line mentality, or in other words, to think the impossible. China must be ready for the worst case scenario and prepare to cope with the potential uncertainty and instability. Given a very complicated situation, both at home and abroad, I think there are three goals for China's future national development, which means to achieve high quality, sustainable, and secure development. And the major policy leverage is the new development pattern featuring so-called dual circulation. The first goal, I think, is high quality development. For example, China will adopt higher environmental protection standards instead of simply pursuing GDP growth at the cost of the environment and health of the people. China will promote China's advancements into the mid to high end of the global industrial supply, innovation, and value chain based on a high-tech driven development model. The second goal is a sustainable development. I think there are three fundamental requirements for that. The first is to deal with the gap between the urban and rural areas. And China will invest more resources to support the revival of the rural areas, as well as to push forward a new round of county-centered urbanization. And the second is to deal with the gap between the rich and poor. China will continue to strengthen the efforts of poverty elimination by providing better career training program, creating high quality employment opportunities, and improving education and healthcare system. And the third is deal with the regional gap, especially between the East and the West region. Beijing will invest more resources to fulfill the development of the Western and Central region of China, as well as to re-energize the Northeast regional economy. And the third goal is to secure development. And as the communique stated that amid the rising tide of protectionism and unilateralism, China must give a strong boost to unleash the potential of domestic demand and secure the development of domestic industrial chains. It also contributed to the unprecedented emphasis of food security, seed security, and farmland security. In order to achieve the three goals, China will nurture a strong domestic market and establish a new development pattern, as I said before, featuring dual circulation, which means China will smooth domestic circulation and let domestic and international circulations reinforce each other, spurring consumption in an all-round way and expanding investment. I think my time is up, right?
Thank you, Professor Xing Qiang. Well, we have a host of questions. All of them are very good, but they're all for individual panelists. So I'm going to do that very soon, as soon as I organize that in my mind. Let me start with perhaps we can start with Professor Xing Qiang and go reverse order, Chris, Katie, and Larry, with a common question. First for Professor Xing, how much has China's strained relationship with the U.S. Been a factor in designing the Fifth Plenum's 5-year economic plan? And do you think relations with the U.S. will shape Chinese foreign and domestic policies during Xi's next term in office? And for our American panelists, how much was U.S. And international affairs more generally a factor in this election cycle? And do you think relations with China will shape America's domestic and foreign policy during the Biden administration? If so, how? Xing老师.
Thank you for the question. I think for every generation of the leadership of China, we think U.S.-China relations is very important. And it's also always, as always, the key factor to influence the foreign policy making of China in the past several decades. And that's why President Xi reiterated that we have 1,000 reasons to have a good U.S.-China relations. and we have no one reason to make it bad. So I think that in the past few decades, especially in the past few years, the deterioration of the U.S.-China relations has hurt the interests of U.S. as well as China. And I think for Beijing, we think the major international or foreign risk comes from the suppression, or maybe you can see the check and balance from the U.S. And we can see that the policy leverages used by Trump administration, it really has destroyed all the cooperation between our two states. And we hope that after President Biden takes office, and the U.S.-China relations, like the life here in China, can be bring back to the normality. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris?
You know, as I mentioned, I'm not sure that policy ever really played much of a role in the ultimate vote for most people in this election. I think certainly even fewer for foreign policy, and even fewer than that, China. That being said, I think sentiments toward China were certainly an underlying factor in sort of the broader themes of the election. You have a president who, you know, again, blamed the coronavirus pandemic on China, and certainly on the economic front, played up the way that he stood up to China with tariffs, and then concluded a free trade agreement, which then led Biden to try to say, well, no, your approach to China was wrong. It really wasn't standing up. You were actually being overly conciliatory. I'm tougher on China than you. So this was really kind of a one-upsmanship that I'm not really sure really was the most in-depth, thoughtful conversation of what our real policy differences are with China, whether it's on military issues, climate change, economic cooperation, trade, intellectual property, the whole range of issues. And so I think it's fair to say it was mostly in this presidential election more about slogans and personality regarding China instead of actual policy differences.
Thank you. Katie?
Right, and I would just add to that, that generally speaking, most Americans are not very well attuned to international affairs. And I think the overwhelming concerns related to COVID, not just people's personal health, but the incredible economic impact, in addition to an administration that appeared to be mishandling and not creating sort of a central message on how to deal with it. I think that most Americans were really preoccupied with the virus, and that sort of, in many ways, kind of diminish the impact. Although, as Chris pointed out, there was definitely some back and forth between Biden and Trump on China policy. But I just think, generally speaking, if you're going at the very base level of voters in Indiana, voters in Arizona, what were they concerned about? I think it was largely the economy. In terms of China in the future, it will absolutely shape, future policies. But I think it's sort of one sort of factor amongst many. I also think it's important to point out that even though it may seem as though we're getting a reset or a reboot when President-elect Biden is sworn in on January 20th, it's also important to realize that the presidency is this continuous stream of issues and personnel, and that Biden has to step into this stream and sort of take command, but he's still inheriting the prior 4 years of President Trump. He has to work past that to establish his own diplomatic relations, his own priorities, and that will take a while. So I think that in the short term, not much will change.
Thank you. Larry?
China was not a major factor in the election. It didn't show up in pre-election polling. It didn't show up in either of the very large exit polls taken on election day and also with the pre-election voters. The only real role that China played in the election was as a punching bag for Donald Trump. He's the sort of politician who always has to have someone or something to blame. And because his administration had done a truly terrible job on the vaccines and on the COVID crisis generally, and had contributed to the high death rate by refusing to wear masks, refusing to social distance, and all the rest of it. He had to have somebody to blame, and he chose to blame China. And this played beautifully with his xenophobic right-wing base. They loved it. There aren't enough of them to win, though. That's the key element. And you say, well, he won in 2016. No, he won because some independents and third-party candidates were running rather selfishly, and they took a large enough proportion of the vote away from Hillary Clinton so that she couldn't win the election even with a 3 million vote plurality. So, maybe China should have been a larger factor in the election, but it wasn't. The election was about COVID. It was about the economy. And most important of all, it was about Donald Trump and whether people had had enough and whether they could even imagine 4 more years of that.
Perfect, Larry, if I could continue with you. Now we go to the individual questions. So several questions for you. Where will the GOP go after this? And also, how did Trump lose the election? To many in China, perhaps he won more votes, a lot of votes, historic record. And so did he lose it because of COVID? Or is there more than that? And if you don't mind, Larry, let me give each of the panelists their questions so they could think about it while we go down the list. For Katie, is the institution, are American democratic institutions dead based on what happened in the last few days, the last 4 years? Or is this something of a temporary phenomenon because you talk about institutions? And is there a lasting impact on Americans' democracy with what has happened? For Chris, there are many questions, but first of all, the 3 branches of government, people in China are concerned that the division of power is going to become a partisan battle in the next few years, and also whether you think the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific narrative will be continued under the Biden administration, and also how long will anti-China sentiment last, in your opinion, based on what you had said. For Professor Xinqiang, you're 1 against 3, so you have a lot of questions, and I think you should just pick the ones you like to answer. What is the role of Belt and Road Initiative in the next 5-year plan, since you didn't mention it? Also, can you talk about environmental policy? How can China coordinate in this fragmented, the person who asked the Chinese actually questioner said, in fragmented authoritarianism, how can China protect the environment and form coherent policy? And lastly, for the American audience, can we imagine a different policy under Xi Jinping with regards to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? So why don't I turn it back to Larry?
All right, Shirley, first, you asked me two separate questions. Donald Trump got 74 million votes, and you are certainly correct. The questioner is correct in suggesting that that is an enormous number and more than any presidential candidate has ever gotten, with only one exception. And the exception is Joe Biden. He got 81 million votes. And in any language, 81 million is a lot more than 74 million. The reason the turnout was so large was because Donald Trump stirs emotions on both sides. And his people were excited to keep him, and a much larger group of people were determined to get rid of him, and they did. So it doesn't mean a thing. In a sense, you had close to 160 million people voting in this election. That was a lot more than the 137 million in 2016, and that was also a pretty good turnout. This was a superb turnout. It was the largest turnout since 1900 in a presidential election in the United States. But just because Donald Trump constantly repeats the number doesn't make it more important than it is. As far as where the Republican Party goes, that's, it's an important question, and nobody is sure precisely. Interesting survey came out today, and surveys didn't do so well in 2016 or 2020. But this was a pretty good one. It was a good sampling. The particulars checked out pretty well. And it showed that President Trump, who has almost always had an approval rating somewhere around the percentage of the vote he's gotten in 2 elections, 46%. Sometimes he would drift down to around 40, but basically he had, as we like to say, a low ceiling and a high floor. He didn't vary very much. Well, this survey showed that his approval ratings are now down to 33%. 60% disapprove of the job performance of Donald Trump. Why is that significant? Because for the very first time, with one exception that I'll mention, he has lost part of his base. They were disgusted, as most Americans were, that he incited an insurrection and that his people, at his encouragement, invaded a co-equal branch of government. And it resulted in 5 deaths, in addition to mayhem, and projecting American democracy in the worst possible way around the world. And he'll never be forgiven for that. Believe me, mark my words, he will never be forgiven for that. And that's why he's on the edge of the impeachment. Conviction in the Senate's impossible because of the number of votes needed. But he's lost his base. He only lost it one other time, and that was back in August of 2017, when his people showed up in large numbers in the place where I'm sitting, Charlottesville, Virginia, and I'm on the lawn of the University of Virginia, where all those neo-Nazis marched down our lawn and then later in another part of Charlottesville, resulting in the death of a young lady who was opposed to their political aims. But this is more important and it's more permanent. If you lose part of your base, and he has, because it's no longer very useful to be associated with Donald Trump, at least in the vast majority of places that are competitive. In deeply Republican red states, it probably still benefits you to be associated with Donald Trump, but that's not where the vote is. So I think right at the end, he's blown it. And the interesting thing is, historically, almost all presidents who've been defeated or who are retiring after 2 terms, the maximum limit allowed, their popularity goes up in their final couple of months. Donald Trump's has sunk dramatically. And people who are well known don't even want to be around him. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, which used to be prestigious, but no longer is because of the people Donald Trump has been giving it to, he decided to have his last Medal of Honor winner be a very popular football coach here in the United States. Well, just minutes ago, while we were chatting, that football coach decided he would decline the honor. He doesn't even want to be in the same room with Donald Trump and accept it. Those things are signals of where someone like Trump is going. The leadership of the Republican Party has been very blunt behind the scenes in the last week or so, at least. They want to cut off the Trump ties just as soon as they possibly can. They wouldn't cry a tear if he left office tonight, if he resigned tonight. They want him gone. And they're going to do everything possible to make sure he doesn't come back. And the Congress in both houses is looking for ways to ban him from ever holding public office again. They may not be able to do it in terms of impeachment and conviction in the Senate. That normally is what happens as a product of conviction in the Senate on impeachment charges. But just an hour ago, I had a conversation with Senator Tim Kaine. He's a member of the U.S. Senate. You may recall he was Senator Hillary Clinton's, or rather Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's running mate in 2016. And he proposed on the record some ways that Congress will do it. And he believes that it will happen. He's well in touch with both sides in the Senate. They will find ways to keep Donald Trump out. If they can keep Trump out, the Republicans have at least a chance to get past the disasters of Donald Trump. Because if they don't do it, I think things will continue to decline for them. Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you, Larry. We've run sort of out of time, so if I could ask the remaining panelists to answer within 1 minute. Katie?
Yeah, sure. You asked me the question of whether I thought that American institutions were dead. And I would say by no means are they dead. However, the last 4 years have really done a number on important aspects of our government, like personnel in particular, the shattering of norms and civil discourse. And it will take some time to recover. I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will be able to sort of turn the ship of state into a better direction. And I think that it can. I think the American government system of government is resilient and we will recover, but we need some time to heal.
Thank you, Katie. Chris, you have several questions.
I was asked about the separation of powers, and I'd simply say that in the President-elect Joe Biden, you have somebody that spent 36 years in the U.S. Senate, someone that chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee. He understands well and respects the important role of the three branches of government, and he will obviously, push hard for his agenda as president, but will respect those institutions of democracy as well as the rule of law.
Thank you, Chris. Xin教授.
Okay, so many questions, 1 minute. And for the Belt and Road Initiative, I think in the future, China's government will continue to strengthen and push forward this initiative, especially to integrate it with the strategies of the other countries, and maybe integrate with the regional architecture in the peripheral areas. Sorry, no time. And second, for the environment protection, I think that's one of the key focus of the government in China. And we can see that China is very active and try to cooperate with the United States and European countries to safeguard the Paris Agreement. And I think it will provide a very good window of cooperation for the U.S. President Biden administration to have some very active coordination and cooperation with China and in the near future. For the Xinjiang, I think that I think the fact speaks louder. And I have been to Xinjiang several times, and I think the reality is very different from what we can see from the described by some Western medias and so-called experts. And my own experience told me that the de-extremization efforts in Xinjiang has been very effective and efficient. And the stability and security in Xinjiang is far more than we imagined, even for the Chinese outside Xinjiang. And I think when you walk around on the street of the Urumqi, and you will not worry, you don't need to worry about you will be shot or be attacked by terrorism or terrorists. And the security and stability in Xinjiang will not only be beneficial to China, but also to all the neighboring countries as well as the whole world. I hope that the whole world, including the United States, will have a much better and deeper understanding of that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all the panelists. We're only slightly behind. I really appreciate Larry, Katie, Chris, and Professor Xinjiang. And we look forward to panel 2. And
thank you.
Ambassador Steve Mall. There you are, Steve. Thank you very much. Take it over.
Thank you very much, Shirley. It's such a pleasure to be a partner with you and to join such a distinguished group of colleagues and friends in this really historic and unprecedented gathering with our great partners at Fudan University to address what I think is really the single most important question in international relations today, namely the future relationship between the United States and China at a unique transition point in both countries' histories, the beginning of the Biden administration and in China after the 5th Chinese Communist Party plenum. Our second panel this evening will examine the implications of these two critical events for this most important relationship. I'm very pleased to welcome 4 distinguished experts from whom I know we're going to be learning a lot in the next hour. First, my old colleague from U.S. Government Service, Evan Feigenbaum, who is now the practitioner senior fellow of the Miller Center's James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center. He is also the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he oversees Carnegie's research in Washington, Beijing, and New Delhi on a dynamic region encompassing both East Asia and South Asia. Evan served as a senior policy official in the George W. Bush administration and played an especially important role in the development of the U.S. China senior dialogue. Second, Professor Sung Go-yo is a professor and deputy director at the Center for American Studies and executive director of the Asia Pacific Cooperation and Government Research Center, a Shanghai University think tank, and director of the Economic Diplomacy Studies Center of Fudan University. He is one of the members of the Advisory Committee for China's Ministry of Commerce and is one of China's leading experts on Chinese economic diplomacy, relations with the United States, and international political economy. My friend, Professor Harry Harding, one of the university's foremost experts in China and one of our most widely published scholars on Chinese affairs. Harry is a Miller Center Faculty Senior Fellow, in addition to serving as one of our most distinguished university-wide professors. Professor Harding was the founding dean of the UVA's Frank Batten School of Policy. He's also adjunct chair professor in the College of Social Science at National Chengchi University in Taipei, where he holds a Yushan Scholarship, the highest honor awarded by Taiwan's Ministry of Education. And finally, Professor Wu Xinbo is Dean of the International Institute of International Studies and Director at Fudan University Center for American Studies, in which capacity he, along with his senior team, have been an extraordinarily valuable partner for UVA in our study of Sino-American relations. He teaches and researches China's foreign and security policy, Chinese-US relations, and US Asia-Pacific policy. So I'd like to turn first to Evan Feigenbaum to ask him for 8 minutes, we're on a tight time leash here, to analyze the prospects for US-China economic relations during the Biden administration. Evan, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve. And it's good to see so many old friends from Fudan as well. I'll give you the headline at the top. I'm deeply pessimistic about the future of the US-China relationship. And so I'm just going to be very candid about that in the 8 minutes that I have. And the core of my pessimism really lies in what I call the securitization of all aspects of the US-China relationship, but particularly of commercial flows. That is to say, the refracting of flows of goods, capital, people, technology, and data through the prism of national security, which has a quite zero-sum character to it. Now, to explain that for you a little bit, when Richard Nixon landed in Beijing in February 1972, that really marked the modern inception of the US-China relationship. And if you think about it, that was a moment when the United States and China were still fighting a proxy war in Vietnam, and China was still coming out of the Cultural Revolution. And so from the very inception of this relationship, the United States and China have had clashing security concepts and obvious differences of political system and ideology. In other words, security competition has been a feature, not a bug, of the US-China relationship throughout the entire 49 years of the relationship. But once the two sides opened an economic relationship, and particularly after China came in the World Trade Organization in 2001, they also began, as I said, to exchange 5 things on a large scale: goods, capital, people, technology, and increasingly data. And this economic relationship proceeded largely on a parallel track from those very fraught security realities. So Taiwan or the South China Sea or military competition, these issues were always in the background for people in the markets or for American companies. They were aware of them, but they mostly stayed in the background and they didn't really impinge on trades or on business models. So in the last 5 years, but especially under Donald Trump, 2 things have happened. First, economics and security have essentially collapsed together. And the United States, as I said, now refracts its view of whether and how, in particular, capital, people, technology, and data should flow through the prism of security concerns. And second, the tools, as Steve knows, having served in government, that the United States has used to slow, control, and in some cases even stop those flows have been extraterritorialized, so that the United States is now offshoring its laws, its administrative levers like export controls, to compel third countries and parties to do like the United States is doing to China. So that is the legacy, in my view, that Donald Trump is bequeathing to Joe Biden. And he has done it, and I'll just be very candid about this, to a lot of cheering from both Republicans and Democrats. And the last panel got into this a little bit. So if your theory of the case was that economic integration was going to mitigate security competition, actually the reverse has happened. Not only has the security competition getting worse, but security is now bleeding back into economics. So why, for example, has the United States now put every major Chinese artificial intelligence company onto the Commerce Department's so-called entity list, which dramatically restricts sales licenses and trade? It's because, as I said, the US government views technology through this zero-sum prism of security, not as commercial goods, but as a set of strategic implications, issues, and levers. Now, technology is especially vulnerable to that because of the way innovation now flows. If you think from the 1940s to the 1960s, military innovation enabled a whole lot of commercial innovation. After the 1960s, because of commercial microelectronics and semiconductors, that flow really reversed. And weapons innovation was enabled by commercial innovation. But the emerging technologies of the future, whether it's artificial intelligence enabled applications, or it's quantum computing, or it's new synthetic and composite materials, these things are intrinsically dual and multiple use in nature. They affect the future of industry and work, but also the future of defense. And for that reason, this refraction is, in my view, going to deepen and continue in the technology area. And I want to be clear about something. In my view, China's doing much the same thing as I'm describing on the American side. In fact, 20 years ago, I wrote a book about techno-nationalism in China that drew on a lot of historical sources to look at how development and security had come together in China. Now, the problem for Trump has been that his administration has used those tools so often and on so many diverse issues with China that there's no strategy to it. It's very ad hoc. So as I often say, they're long on attitude and they're short on strategy. But the Biden team, in my view, are systematizers, institutionalizers, and multilateralists. And since, as I said earlier, there is bipartisan agreement on the need for a more competitive and, in my view, security-centric approach to China, the irony of the change of administration, and here I'll start to move toward the conclusion, is that this is likely not just to produce a lot of continuity, but to see an administration that actually makes use of many of the same tools that the Trump team has used, but to use them, in my view, more effectively, even as they are used more discreetly, more systematically, and more in partnership with third countries that also share the American sense of concern and grievance with China. So in sum, I expect 5 things to happen, and I'll do these in bites. 1, I think the Biden team would like to put a floor under the free fall that the U.S. China relationship has been in and pivot to something that looks more like a considered strategy rather than just making speeches and firing off nasty grams at the government of China. 2, however, they will sharpen the competition with China, in my view, by leveraging many of the same tools, especially around technology and data flows that the Trump team used, but they're going to do it better and more strategically. 3, they will look to cooperate with China in 3 areas that the Trump team did not. And to put it simply, that agenda is stopping the pandemic, rebooting growth, and averting environmental catastrophe. And that means that the pandemic and especially climate change coordination are going to come back in a big way into the U.S.-China relationship. 4th, they'll try to work with partners, especially in Europe and Japan, on a joint agenda with China. I suspect that will be tougher than they think. But 5, and last, they will not want to let Republicans make them look, quote unquote, weak on China. And so on issues from human rights to security to many of the economic issues, the political incentives will be tough. And for people like Tony Blinken, the incoming Secretary of State, or like Jake Sullivan, the incoming National Security Advisor, who will naturally want to engage in some diplomacy with China, not just around China, they will also want to compete strategically with China. And so that last point will pose an interesting political challenge as they think about, as I said, how to reboot elements of the relationship, but in this much more competitive and securitized context. Why don't I stop there?
Thanks very much, Evan. Fascinating. Professor Sung, I'd like to turn to you to ask for your analysis of the prospects for the U.S. China economic relations during Xi's next term and the new 5-year plan.
Hi, I'm not Xin Chang. I think in the screen the name is Xin Chang. I'm Song Guoyu. I'm very, with beard. I'm very happy to be here to discuss the future China-U.S. economic relations during Biden's administration. I just heard Ivan's, how to say, judgment, very pessimism. Yes, if you are right, it will prove that China's government's choice is right, because China's government choose the new direction, dual circulation, because Chinese government think that United States cannot be relied anymore in the future, because you are so pessimistic of the future China-U.S. relations. So I will discuss 4 topics with you guys. One is the new economic directions in the 14-5 plan. Second is what's the general picture of China-U.S. Economic relations? I mean, in the terms of power and capacity. And third, the cooperation list. And fourth, the confrontation or how to say, the competition list in the future. So topic 1, the new economic directions or strategy and 14-5 plan. The key topic, the key word is dual circulation. Why China, China's leadership initiate dual circulations? Number 1, the deglobalization over the past years. And number 2, the trade protectionism taken by President Trump and the United States government. And 3, we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic situation. And number 4, I think the reason is that the internal development growth, because Chinese government want to increase the welfare of China's domestic peoples, in the future. So based on the 4 reasons I just introduced, China's government decided to follow the new economic development thinking or strategy, dual circulation. But we must have a balanced understanding of dual circulation. It's not just to emphasize too much on one side, internal circulation or external circulation. We must have a balanced understanding of that. On the internal dual circulation, which means I think we must China must expand its domestic consumption and have more independent technology and science innovation. So this is a key in my mind to understand the dual circulation. How about the external circulation? We continue to attract foreign capital. We continue to introduce foreign technology. So this is not a 1 or 0 choice. It's not a 0-sum choice. It's a balanced choice for Chinese government. We must have a whole picture understanding of this dual strategy. And topic 2, how to understand China-U.S. economic interaction in the future. My general judgment is that in the future, at least, even in the Biden administration, China and the US will witness more balanced economic interaction in the future. The reason is quite simple. Last year, 2020, China accounted for more than 74 or 75% of US GDP, which is very, very important to understand the future interaction between China and the United States. So if China will continue to have 4% of GDP growth rate in the future in the next 4 years. And the United States, how about United States GDP growth rate? I don't know, maybe 2% or 1.5%. if we have a simple calculation, not a circulation, sorry, calculation, if we have a simple calculation, in the last year of Biden's administration, I mean, 2024, right? China's GDP will account for 82 or 84% of America's GDP, which means the United States cannot, how to say, what do you want to say? I mean, 歧视, how to say, yeah, discriminate China's, as usual, because China is a big guy. Okay. For Chinese people, we don't, at least I hate to say, discrimination, because we have no discrimination. Topic 3, the corporationist. Although there is very, very, it's very difficult for China and the Biden administration to restart the cooperation, but I will propose several fields to cooperate in the future. One is global economic coordination. United States economy is not very good. Actually, it's very bad. And for Biden's administration, the #1 priority for this administration is to recover its economy. So if we think about the experience for the two countries in 28, what happened then? Very, very intensive global economic coordination then. So I hope, and it's very important for those two countries to have a global economic coordination. And 2, global climate change. I would call President Biden as a climate change president. I do believe he is very, very sincere, very, very serious to curb the global warming, emission. I do believe that. So if he is right, China and the United States can do lots of things, policy coordination to do something on this issue. For instance, the new energy, vehicles, the green finance corporations, etc. And corporation 3, I think, is how those two countries, China and United States, do something to restore the distorted policy taken by President Trump. I know something cannot be changed. For instance, the tariff. I mean, it seems that Biden will also, continue the tariff policy towards China. I understand that, but we can do something to, partially restore the distorted policy taken by President Trump. And how about competition? At least 4 competitions. Yeah, 1 more than the cooperation list. Competition for the rules. China has joined RCEP and has established the China-EU bilateral investment treaty, right? So I don't know what Biden will do, Biden administration will do, but in my mind, there will be more competition than cooperation in the future. So this is a competition for rules and a competition for technology, just as Ivan, emphasized very much. I agree with you. Yes, it's right. Competition for high-tech technology. And
excuse me, Professor Sung, I'm afraid we're running out of time. I wonder if we could wrap up now.
Oh, okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I'm sure we'll get to hear from you a little bit later. Harry, can we turn to you now to talk about the prospects for change and continuity as we go through a new transition to a new administration here in the United States in China policy?
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Steve. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you all. In a way, it's still too early to talk about the issue of change and continuity. The new administration has not yet been inaugurated. It'll take some time to set things up. The administration is still being formed. but still, let me give you my ideas of the elements of change and then talk about continuity, and because I think there will be a mixture of both. The most important change, of course, is that on November 20th, we will have a new president, a man who has worked on China policy throughout his career, both as a senator and as a vice president. Biden was a major part of the Obama administration's effort to build close personal relations with Xi Jinping when both men were their country's vice presidents. But there's no reason to believe that this produced a particularly warm relationship between the two men, or that Biden will therefore be soft on China because of it. On the contrary, Biden has described Xi Jinping in quite unflattering terms recently, and my own encounters with Biden when he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee indicated that he was consistently quite skeptical of China's domestic and foreign behavior, and skeptical of those who sought to justify it or explain it away. There will also be, of course, major changes in personnel throughout the executive branch, with new cabinet secretaries, from ambassadors and cabinet secretaries down to the level of deputy assistant secretary. And the selection of these political appointees will provide important clues as to the future directions of American China policy. Now, few personnel appointments specifically related to China have been made so far, but here's what we know, and here's what I think we can expect. Tony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, is not a China specialist, and he's more of a Europeanist than an Asianist, but he is broadly experienced and a widely respected generalist. My personal experience with Blinken was very positive. I met him when he was Senior Director for Strategic Planning on the National Security Council staff, and I was asked to brief the White House press corps on the exchange of visits by Presidents Bill Clinton and Jiang Zemin in the latter part of the 1990s. I was not told what to say. I was not told what not to say. I was simply expected to give the best analysis I could. And this conforms with Blinken's reputation as a consummate professional who wants relevant officials and stakeholders to get the best possible information and advice they can. Now, his immediate task as Secretary of State will be to rebuild the State Department, greatly weakened during the Trump administration, and to reinvigorate relations with friends and allies. So China, while very important, may not be his central focus, at least at the beginning. Several of the other senior appointments that have been announced are also known for taking tough positions on China, particularly Catherine Tai as the U.S. Trade Representative. Jake Sullivan, the new National Security Advisor, who has worked closely with Biden for many years, has co-authored a recent article about the competitive nature of the U.S.-China relationship and has written of the need to build a stronger America so that it can compete more effectively. But he's also spoken of the importance of cooperating with China where possible and of picking the arenas of competition carefully. His co-author, Kurt Campbell, has also been a skeptic about China and was the architect of the rebalance to Asia during the Obama administration, one of whose purposes was to balance against China's rise. He is rumored to return to government as Senior Director for Asia on the National Security Council, which would give him responsibility to coordinate the government's Asia policy across all departments. Now, below the very top, few China-specific appointments have yet been made, but we're told by an anonymous senior advisor that appointments will be given to those who are associated with a tougher line on China rather than on the previous policy known as engagement. He said, and I quote, "We expect to be taking a stronger position on China than has been the case in past Democratic administrations." He added that additional staff will be added to the National Security Council to deal with, and again I quote him, "a much more assertive China abroad and a much more repressive China." This will be a reference to the creation of new National Security Council positions to deal with health, new technologies, human rights, and climate change, all of which are increasingly important issues in the U.S.-China relationship. In addition, Biden favors appointees with prior experience in government, and many of his appointees have previously served in the Clinton or Obama administrations. This is worrying to some who believe that the new administration should be bringing in new people with new ideas. It's also disappointing to others who hoped for appointments but do not already have the high-level government experience that Biden seems to prefer. But put together, these statements imply that there may be relatively few new faces, but there will be a tougher position on China than in the first half of the Obama administration, and a more thoughtful and better coordinated policy than during the Trump administration. As for continuity, Biden will continue to see China as a major challenge and a major competitor, just as the Trump administration did. It's also likely that compared with Trump, Biden will use less inflammatory rhetoric and will try to work more closely with allies and through multilateral institutions. Working through multilateral institutions may be difficult because of the strong influence that China has in several of them. But working with allies will be facilitated by the fact that many of them have become more suspicious of China's intentions and more apprehensive about its increasing capabilities and want the United States to serve as a counterbalance to China. This is especially true of countries that have been the target of Chinese coercive diplomacy and wolf warrior tactics, such as Australia, Canada, and South Korea, where negative impressions of China are at record highs. Still, many of them will be reluctant to support American policies that would limit their economic relations with China or risk embroiling them in a U.S. China conflict. It remains to be seen which of Trump's China policies will be retained and which will be abandoned or modified by the Biden administration. Finally, we also expect that Biden will want to re-engage in high-level dialogue with Beijing, but it's not yet clear whether that dialogue can lead to any significant improvement of the relationship, and I'll say more about that later. If this is indeed Biden's approach to China, it will be supported by a bipartisan consensus in Congress, especially now that the Democrats have regained control of the Senate. This consensus is also shared by the public, a majority of whom believe that China is an unfriendly country that poses serious challenges to American interests. Nonetheless, I predict that just as Blinken will focus on rebuilding the State Department and improving relations with allies, Biden will be largely focused on domestic policy, seeing as his main priorities to control the pandemic, address climate change, reduce the polarization in American political life, stimulate the American economy, and make it more equitable. China will not be his central focus, but some of these priorities will be directed at increasing the American ability to compete effectively with China, and he may well invoke China to build domestic support for those policies. But at the same time, some of these priorities, especially dealing with the pandemic and limiting climate change, are areas of potential cooperation with China if the two countries can agree to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Harding. Now, Professor Wu, I'd like you to take the same question, but from the Chinese perspective. What prospects do you see for continuity and change in the relationship?
Thank you, Ambassador Moore. Nice to see you again. Good morning, everyone. Needless to say, the last 4 years has been the most frictious period in U.S.-China relations since normalization. However, China has emerged from the last 4 years even stronger and more self-confident, stronger in economic terms. And last year, I think China's overall GDP is going to surpass 75% of that of the United States. More self-confident in terms of China's governance capacity, especially in the case of dealing with the sudden outbreak of COVID-19. On the other hand, the United States today has been much weakened politically, economically, and socially by a combination of internal and external developments. What is even more interesting is that today, China is more in favor of free trade and multilateral economic arrangements, while the United States has become less in favor of free trade and more protectionist. So bearing in mind this overall context about China-US relations. Now I want to point to three trends that China may pursue in the years to come in dealing with the United States. First, I think China will reduce its economic dependence on the United States in terms of market technology, U.S. currency, and U.S. Even the U.S. payment system. To some extent, Donald Trump's trade war, technology blockade, and sanctions against China have served as a useful wake-up call to China that over-reliance on the United States is a big risk, and that has generated big vulnerability for China. So what China has been doing is to rely more on its domestic market and to promote technological indigenous innovation, and also to promote the internationalization of renminbi, the Chinese currency, and also moved to forge RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, with countries in the Western Pacific and East Asia, and also just concluded China-Europe bilateral investment treaty negotiation. So I think this trend may be moving faster or slower depending on the context, but overall it will be irreversible. So that's the first observation. Second observation is that I think China will take a firmer stance, a more resistant stance towards the pressure from the United States politically, diplomatically, and on security front. So the U.S. observers have argued that Biden will take get tough on China, and I think so is the case for China. China will get tough with the United States as well. One reason is that we are now thinking about these relations more and more in the context of strategic competition. So if the U.S. treats China as a serious strategic competitor, China will do the same. And also another major factor is the changing domestic public opinion in China. And this kind of anti-Americanism stirred by the Trump administration's China policy is running so high that we haven't seen in the last 20 years. All this will make sure that China's approach to the United States will be equally tough, if not tougher. The third trend is that I think China will be less willing to cooperate with the United States on international and regional issues, even though some of the US observers point out that Biden would like to cooperate with China on the issues of US concern. Why is the case? Two reasons. One is that I think the US has become more skeptical about China's growing international role. This is no longer the time the US side talk about China serving as a responsible stakeholder. Evan is still there, right? And today you don't worry about China doing less. You just worry about China doing more. So time has changed. So why China is so willing to cooperate with the United States on the issues of US concern? And also another factor is that the US has lost a lot of credibility under the Trump administration. I mean, you cooperated with other countries to form some international agreement, and then you just walk away from it. So how can we trust Americans in this multilateral arrangement? So these are the three major trends that I think may continue under the Biden administration. On the other hand, I think China will also try to seek to improve, at least stabilize relations with the United States in several ways. First is to stabilize economic relations. For example, whether the the extra tariff imposed under the Trump administration will be gradually removed in a reciprocal way, and also maybe some level of technological cooperation can be resumed. The concern here is not so much about expanding economic ties, but rather to stabilize it. The second is that on the security front, instead of building mutual trust and expanding bilateral security cooperation in providing public goods for international community, the priority for China is really how to work with the US side to prevent some accidental conflicts in the Western Pacific. Third, on the international issues, of course, we still need to pursue some necessary and pragmatic cooperation. However, the question is really at what price and on what terms. So my two final observation is that we are not going to come up with a joint vision about this relationship in the next 4 years or even long term. But what we can do is to gradually rebuild the trust between two leaders and two governments. And without that, we cannot really work together to manage this relationship, either to cooperate on limited issues or to manage the differences and disputes. Second, I think that the approach is no longer to be top-down, which means that we have a grand vision and we have a common agenda, and then we pursue this relationship, but rather bottom-up. We may try to work together in certain specific areas, like global public health, climate change, Iran nuclear deal, and gradually we rebuild the trust and rebuild the momentum so that we can achieve more progress in bilateral cooperation. So overall, I may not be as pessimistic as Evan, but I would be very cautious in predicting the future of this relationship in the next 4 years. So with that, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Wu. Really fascinating points that you made. We're getting a lot of questions in from the audience, which is good. It shows that people are very interested in what you have to say. While, as Shirley did previously, while I organize those, I'd like to ask each of the panelists, beginning in the same order, what are there any, is there any grounds for optimism in this relationship? Could there be any kind of reset that would allow fresh cooperation on some of these issues that Professor Wu just mentioned? And conversely, what issue do you think will pose the greatest risk for confrontation between the two countries? So if we could start with you, Evan, and then go with Professor Sung, then Harry, and then Professor Wu. Evan.
Sure. Steve, the first thing I'd say is I don't think it's hard to conceive of a cooperative agenda between the United States and China. This is not an intellectual problem. In many ways, it's a political problem. Xinbo said something interesting, my old friend. He said, if the United States treats China as a competitor, then we're going to treat you as a competitor. Competition to me is not a dirty word. In sports, in business, and in life, competition makes you better. So the problem right now is that not that the United States and China are engaged in a strategic competition, but that the relationship looks more like what I would call managed enmity. In competition, you try to outdo the other guy by investing in yourself and being better. In a situation of enmity, you try to actively obstruct one another. And if you think about it, right now we're living through the worst public health crisis in over 100 years and the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And the United States and China are not leading or organizing collective action, and in some ways are actively obstructing one another. So this gets back to your question about the cooperative agenda, because if you think about it, security competition, as I said in my setup remarks, is not new. And in fact, at some of the moments of highest strategic tension, the United States and China have in fact managed to coordinate, even when they don't cooperate, on scary transnational threats, not because they're in love, not because they're buddies, but because they found in the interest of their own citizens and in a highly self-interested way, ways to cooperate. I'll give you an example. The last major pandemic was the Ebola outbreak in 2014. And American and Chinese scientists were working side by side in Western Africa and Sierra Leone, including in laboratories, to deal with the pandemic and prevent it from being globalized. And that was a time when China had just introduced an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea. And in some ways, security tensions in the relationship had spiked. So at various instances, whether it's dealing with the financial crises and preventing financial contagion, or it's dealing with pandemics, the agenda is there. But I think, as I said, the securitization of everything makes this much harder. So part of the challenge we need to get is to see self-interested cooperation, or at least coordination, as not being a negative, to see competition as natural, and to find ways to move away from what I think is really enmity to a more natural set of conditions of strategic competition. And coordination in that context ought to be self-interested. It's not a favor the two sides ought to do each other. But on the things I said before, stop the pandemic, reboot growth, avert environmental catastrophe, there's a pretty straightforward agenda that the two sides can find. The foreign policy issues are much tougher, and the hardest thing in the relationship, quite frankly, is Taiwan.
All right, thank you very much, Evan. Professor Sung.
Hi, this is Professor Song again. Okay, my biggest concern is that, I didn't mention, but I really want to emphasize for all, audience here is that a divided United States might follow a divided policy or strategy toward China. And Mr. Biden cannot fully control the situation in the United States, and the China policy will be kind of, hostage of China-U.S. relations. This is my biggest concern. And if some hawkish politicians in the United States, are trying to take advantage of China as kind of, advantage over other its competitors domestically, I think this will be the biggest, danger for China-U.S. relations. Back to China-U.S. bilateral economic relations, I think the best, one of the best dangers is that the negative economic security dilemma between our two countries. I just observed that actually, a quite natural policy taken by United States, either China side, will be regarded as a very, very aggressive policy toward another side. For instance, China argues that China cannot rely more on the United States, just as mentioned by Professor Wu, Evan, and myself. But this kind of quite natural policy would be regarded, by our United States friends or experts as kind of aggressive approach towards China, towards United States. And I also understand that some policies taken by the American side, even in Trump administration, is quite natural. It will defend its own national security or interests. I think that, but this kind of policy will regarded by some Chinese experts or leaders as kind of very aggressive policy toward China. So how to handle this kind of negative economic security dilemma would be very, very important, and I think it's critical to test the Biden administration in the future. So we need to build our bilateral trust. Only we have trust, we can, just break the negative or the very, very miserable, the trap of misunderstanding or economic security, dilemma in the future. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sung. Harry?
I guess there are two questions that you posed to me, Steve. The first one is, can the relationship be reset? Depends what you mean. If it means kind of going back to zero, getting a fresh start, that's not possible. There's too much water over the dam, as we say in the United States. But if we mean reset in the sense of that famous reset button that Hillary Clinton presented to her Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, that was mistranslated. The word that was used in Russian meant emergency stop. And that, I think, is important to do. If we stop doing the wrong things, if we stop making things worse, that, I think, would be a very, very great contribution at this time. As everyone said, it'll be difficult to build a cooperative relationship, but at least we can reset it in the sense of stopping making things worse. With regard to the most serious risk, again, it is Taiwan. Basically, the problem here is that China's policy towards Taiwan has not been effective. It has not been able to appeal to Taiwanese people who increasingly value their democracy, see that they have their own identity, and above all, reject the idea that they should be reunified with China under the same one country, two systems formula as applied to Hong Kong. So I think that it's urgent that the two sides find some way, three sides really, of stopping the buildup of arms in the Taiwan Straits area, have crisis management mechanisms, and be able to prevent or to de-escalate crises if they occur. Over the longer term, it's also important to start having creative thinking about how to solve the Taiwan question more permanently. Ideas like a Chinese economic community, a common market, even a federal system. As controversial as these ideas may be, it's really important to start having fresh thinking about how the Taiwan issue could actually be resolved rather than simply managed.
Thanks very much, Harry. And finally, Professor Wu.
Well, let me first get back to what Evan mentioned, competition in China-US relations. Well, in China, we used to believe relations with the United States is a combination of both cooperation and competition, which means we are both partners and competitors, which was true to the reality of China-US relations. However, when the US side under the Trump administration started to describe this relationship as one of strategic competition, and we, in the last several years, we certainly heard Americans talk about China as a partner in certain areas at all. So that means cooperation and coordination is no longer part of this relationship. Even more than that, what the Trump administration has been doing in pursuing a competition with China is not a benign competition, but a malign competition. And even worse, this competition has moved toward strategic confrontation. So this has worked to reshape the Chinese thinking about the nature of this relationship. So I think that has a lot of impact on China's policy behavior in the years to come. Now, speaking more specifically, I think we should start to cooperate in two areas. One is what to do with the extra tariff imposed in the last 4 years in a way to gradually re-stabilize the economic ties. So I think this is one thing both sides would like to address. Even Biden admitted during the campaign that this tariff war has hurt the United States more than it does towards China, right? On the other hand, we should cooperate in helping stabilizing the situation in the Taiwan Strait. I share opinion with Harry and Evan that my concern, not just in short term, but even in the mid term, that Taiwan could be the most explosive issue in China-US relations, especially the Trump administration in the last several years has rediscovered the strategic value of Taiwan in strategically containing China. Look at what Pompeo has been doing in the last 1 week on the Taiwan issue. That's just crazy. That's just crazy. So for me, I also have a concern that the spillover effect of US domestic politics on its China policy is a major source of concern for China. For Biden, maybe the same for Trump. Sometimes the China policy has been hijacked by the US domestic politics, which has become more and more irrational and sometimes driven by this kind of xenophobia. So this is also part of my concern.
Thank you, Professor Wu. I think we have time for one last set of questions, and I'd like to use those questions to address two of the bigger flashpoints in U.S. China relations, Taiwan and Hong Kong. First, on Taiwan, I'd like to direct this question to our Chinese colleagues. This is from Sam Dryman. He wonders that there's so much different about the Trump administration, one of which is its Secretary of State is making major new policy initiatives in his last days in office. And one of those has just been announced in the last few days, an intention to significantly enhance U.S. Taiwanese relations, including allowing an unprecedented level of contact between Taiwanese officials and American officials. And so I'd be interested in your views on that, Professor Sung and Professor Wu. And then on Hong Kong, I'd like to ask Harry and Evan a question from Professor Tu from Fudan University, who notes that every country in the world has national security laws, and the new national security law in Hong Kong addresses secession, subversion, terrorism, foreign collusion. These are common themes in national security laws around the world. Why should the United States care so much about those issues in Hong Kong? So Professor Sung, if I could ask your question, ask you to answer the question on Taiwan, followed by Professor Wu, and then let's jump to Hong Kong with Evan and Harry.
Well, I think on the Taiwan issue, this is going to be the single most important issue in China-U.S. relations again. After we have, somehow boxed in this issue for so many years, largely because on the U.S. side, as I just mentioned, there is a trend to rediscover Taiwan's strategic value in dealing with China. Not just to play the Taiwan card as a diplomatic leverage, but rather really how to contain the rise of China strategically. So that is a very dangerous trend on the US side. So from the Chinese side, frankly speaking, I think the people are getting more impatient about the developments in Taiwan. Having tried with approach of peaceful reunification and promoting cross-strait economic, cultural, people-to-people exchanges for several decades, now we fear that the island may be drifting away further from the mainland for a couple of reasons, some pointed to by Harry Harding. So the pressure is building up here in China about, a more effective way in dealing with the Taiwan issue. So we are not talking about a time frame for solving the Taiwan issue, but certainly I think the pressure is building up. People are losing patience, and especially when you sit in Shanghai or Beijing watching the growing interactions, ties between Taipei and Washington, so that further exacerbate the anxiety over the Taiwan issue. So I think that's how this issue is becoming more dangerous and potentially explosive.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Wu.
So again, with Bill. Okay, this is the reason why okay, I have Bill. Okay, for Taiwan issue, I want to say two observations. One is that this is Americans or Trump administration's fault to destroy the balance between across Taiwan Straits. I think this is, we must identify whose mistake. I think this is Trump's administration's mistake to destroy the balance. So if there is anything, unbreakable, policy taken by Beijing, this is not Beijing's fault. And point two, I want to share with you is that actually, in short term, Trump administration seems to have a lot of aggressive policy towards Beijing. It seems that Washington had won some advantage or against China, Beijing, but in the long term, I don't know how long, but maybe 5 years or 8 years, long term, this what Trump administration's policies or Pompeo's policies options actually help Beijing unify Taiwan in the long term. Without the aggressive options or policies, changed by Pompeo or United States, Beijing cannot have such a favorable, domestic poll. If you look at a domestic poll, you will see most of Chinese people actually more and more support Beijing to unify, Taipei. So you cannot. I don't know how Biden's policy, but if you look at if you evaluate Trump's policy, you cannot want to shame Beijing and do something actually is very, very bad strategically for your own national interest. So this are my two judgments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sung. So let's jump across the sea and address Hong Kong. Harry, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I think that Hong Kong is of concern to the United States, and Chinese colleagues ask, why do you care? Because so many Americans live there. I live much of my time in Hong Kong these days. I'm a Hong Kong resident. I'm married to a Hong Kong person. And so, of course, I'm concerned about what happens in Hong Kong. Is it the national security law? Yes, every country has some kind of national security law. But the question is, how is it going to be implemented? What is going to be considered to be sedition, subversion, and especially for foreigners like me, collusion with foreign powers, with foreign entities? We don't know. And there is really no clarity. And one senses that Beijing would prefer that there not be clarity, want to keep people in suspense, self-censoring, uncertain about what is going to happen. And it's not just the national security law. We worry about the future of freedom of the press. We worry about the future of the judiciary. We worry about the future of the education system. Like Taiwan, Hong Kong is an issue where I would urge the Chinese side not to make the situation worse. And I think that I would leave that is my final plea. That kind of reset, let's not do any further harm to the relationship, is especially urgent at this fraught moment.
Thank you, Harry. And last word to you, Evan.
I think we can leave it where Harry did.
All right, our famous Hong Kong resident, Harry. Well, thanks very much. Well, I'm afraid we have reached the end of time for our panel. I'd now like to turn the microphone over to Professor Wu Jinbo to conclude our conference this evening with warm thanks from UVA for being such a wonderful partner for our university. Professor Wu, over to you, and I hope to see you again soon.
Well, thank you, Steve. I want to start by thanking the two teams from both sides for making this happen. And so far, this panel has been very successful, which are both very well for China-U.S. relations in the next 4 years. Who knows? Maybe it will turn out much, much better than we are anticipating today. Usually, for China-U.S. relations, if we start with high expectation, then it may end up going low. But sometimes if we start with a low expectation, maybe it will end up going high. So let's cross our fingers. Anyway, I'm glad that we have a very candid and constructive dialogue today with the participants of students from Fudan University, and also the UVA students studying at Fudan sitting in our conference room. And I understand this is only the first exercise of our bilateral cooperation, and I do look forward to the next stage of our dialogue and several months from now. So With that, I hope the situation will be back to normal soon in the United States, both politically and socially, so that we can go back to Washington and we go to UVA to revisit you guys, and we have real in-person discussion. So thank you again, and good night.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Professor Wu. And I'd like to turn the floor back to Harry, back to Bill Antholis, the chief of the Miller Center. Bill, over to you.
Well, Steve, and to all of our colleagues at Fudan, just thank you all so very much. Even if we can't be there with you physically, we look forward to being able to do that sometime in the near future. I learned so much again, and it's such a great reintroduction to me to U.S. China relations. So thanks in particular to Shirley for putting this together and our teams for working together. And with that, good day in China and good night to our colleagues in the United States.
Okay.
All right.